Greetings. On behalf of the 18 denominations that make up the North Carolina Council of Churches, I'm Susanna Tuttle. For the past 11 years, I have served as director of the North Carolina Council of Churches Interfaith Power and Light campaign. And it is in prayer and with grace that I welcome everyone to day 3 of our 2022 Critical Issues Seminar, The Ties That Bind Democracy. On Monday, we heard from former Charlotte Mayor Jennifer Roberts and former State Supreme Court Justice Bob Orr, who are co-conveners on behalf of the Carter Center, and focused on the important work of maintaining confidence in the integrity of our elections and ensuring the safety of those who exercise their right to vote. Yesterday, we heard a presentation on why redistricting matters from Hillary Harris Klein, an attorney with Southern Coalition for Social Justice, one of the organizations that holds our lawmakers accountable when access to the polls is suppressed or voting districts become less than competitive. Both sessions will be uploaded to our YouTube channel, and we hope you will continue to review the material with your congregations, families, colleagues, and communities. Today, our featured speaker is Melissa Price Kromm, Director of North Carolina Voters for Clean Elections, on the topic Courts at the Crossroads. Melissa will share about the very important work she does, but first, let me tell you a few things about her. Melissa Price Kromm is the Director of North Carolina Voters for Clean Elections, North Carolina's leading voice for returning power to citizens and lessening the corrosive influence of special interests in state politics. Melissa serves as a lobbyist and leader of the coalition. This coalition has successfully passed the now repealed voter-owned public financing for select judicial and council of state races, bipartisan electronic disclosure reform, and helped stop an effort to pack the North Carolina Supreme Court in 2016. Recently, Melissa led efforts to stop judicial gerrymandering and legislative appointment of judges in North Carolina, including a constitutional amendment. Before joining North Carolina Voters for Clean Elections, Melissa was part of a successful effort to pass same-day voter registration at early voting sites in North Carolina. Melissa, thank you for all that you do. We are so glad to have with us to discuss why our state courts are vital to protecting constitutional rights and protections, to learn how our courts impact our daily lives, and to understand what is at stake for North Carolinians. I turn it over to you.
Thank you, everybody, for having me. So Court at the Crossroads. So as you know, our nonpartisan courts have been under assault for at least, especially the last decade. And today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about why it's incredibly important to keep our courts independent. Next slide, please. So a little bit about why courts matter. No matter whether the issue is marriage equality, voting rights, healthcare, immigration, our courts play an incredibly vital role in the lives of all Americans. Now, more than ever, we need to protect our courts and uphold our constitutional protections and rights. Now, the founders designed America's court system to ensure that the United States would be a nation of rule of law, and that the courts at the federal and state level would be one of 3 co-equal branches of government to ensure that there are checks and balances of power. People rely on their federal and state courts to give everyone a fair hearing, to resolve disputes objectively based upon the evidence presented. Now, while it is true that America's state courts have not always lived up to this standard, It is imperative that we continue to strive to improve and reform our state and federal courts so that everyone can rely on them to apply the law fairly and impartially to protect our people's rights and liberties. Now, America's democracy has evolved over time, expanding political participation to ensure that every US citizen can vote and enjoy the same rights and liberties and protections. Now, the courts have evolved over time too, and they need to continue to do so to ensure that everyone has equal access to justice. Next slide. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about state courts today because as we have learned, state courts and state constitutions play a key role in protecting individual rights and freedoms, especially now that we're seeing our United States Supreme Court continuing to kind of kick everything down from redistricting to abortion access down to the states. Now, many state constitutions go further than the US Constitution in protecting individual rights, including North Carolina's Constitution. As we are seeing with, for example, like the voter ID legal challenges, equal protection. In other words, the US Constitution functions as a floor, not a ceiling, when it comes to protecting people's individual rights. Now, over the last few years, our courts have continually stepped up to protect the integrity and sanctity of our elections and to stop radical politicians from taking away our rights and freedoms. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. Now, and why state courts are so important. Although many people are kind of unaware of the role and how of state courts and how they play in everyday lives, what I want you to walk away from this remembering is that 95% of all legal cases in the United States happen at state courts. So in the past decade, North Carolina courts have, lawmakers used a midnight veto in 2012 to try to override the teachers union, the North Carolina Association of Educators' ability to charge dues through payroll deductions. A state judge ruled that unconstitutional. The state Supreme Court actually sided with Governor Pat McCrory over lawmakers in a disagreement over who could control certain environmental functions, including coal ash cleanup. State courts ruled that that attempts to move North Carolina judicial elections away from voting for them up or down to creating something called retention elections. So it's not like you would just have, 2 people or 3 people on the ballot. It would just be, okay, here's your incumbent, up or down. They looked at our state constitution and they were like, it says we have to elect our judges. So they ruled that unconstitutional. It was actually part of a scheme in 2015 to try to rig the state Supreme Court. They forced deceptive ballot amendment language off and made the legislature actually rewrite constitutional amendment ballots in the summer of 2018. They stopped multiple power grabs at the State Board of Elections. There's many lawsuits on that. Let's see, let's go down to the next slide. They struck down efforts to try to strip veteran teachers of tenure rights. They struck down the ballot amendment language. And then the biggest one you probably have heard of this year is they overturned the 2020 redistricting maps. And there's more court cases behind those redistricting maps too. But, the legislature was forced to, there was a redraw and there was different maps. And then the congressional maps were chosen from the special master. So you have arguably more fairer maps because state courts intervened. A little bit about what federal courts have been doing in North Carolina. If you remember, in 2012, voters passed an amendment to the state constitution banning LGBTQ marriage. Federal courts ruled that measure invalid in 2014. Federal courts also struck down a law that required abortion providers to show a woman an ultrasound and describe the image in detail 4 hours before she could have an abortion. Lawmakers crafted, you probably all remember this, lawmakers crafted a sweeping, what we call the monster voting law in North Carolina. Federal courts struck down much of that, including the voter ID provisions, the same-day voter registration provisions, the pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds. And also federal courts were responsible for overturning some of our redistricting maps. So these are all things that your courts have done to stand up to protect your rights and liberties. Next slide, please. So we also have some cases ongoing that you're going to want to pay attention to. We have cases for voter ID in federal and state court right now. We are waiting on those any month now. As you know, there was an amendment on the 2018 ballot to enshrine voter identification to vote into our Constitution. And arguably that, according to our Constitution, violates the Equal Protection Clause, and there's lawsuits moving on that right now. There's also a voter ID and income tax constitutional amendment case going that actually has to do, it's called the usurper case. It's like the legislature was unconstitutionally gerrymandered at the time. They barely got this amendment onto the ballot. I was there. It was like 1 or 2 votes over the 3/5 majority to actually get something on a ballot. And so they're arguing that because of the legislature being gerrymandered, that they didn't actually have the power to get them onto the ballot. That case is ongoing. In the North Carolina Supreme Court is hearing a second chance voting case for previously incarcerated individuals. You may have heard this as a felon disenfranchisement. It's the fact that in North Carolina, if you have committed a felon, the law says that until you go through all your probation and fines and everything, then you don't get your right to vote back. Well, this case would arguably get it back, upon exit of jail. That case is ongoing. And then the big one you've probably heard about, and it's getting a lot of press, is something called the Leandro case. This is an education funding case, and it's a great example of how our courts can protect our rights and liberties. So I'm going to use this as an example, and I'm going to go into a little bit of detail on it. Obviously, I'm a mom of 3. I care about this case a lot because I've seen firsthand how underfunding our education system in North Carolina has impacted my own children. I've seen their favorite teacher leave for a better paying job. I've seen that there was only 1 set of crumbling social studies books to go across 3 classrooms. I've seen, my daughter have no Spanish teacher on weeks on end. In fact, my own kindergartner doesn't even have a teacher right now. So these are all scenarios that all 3 of my children have faced because we are not adequately funding our education system here in North Carolina. And it just really shouldn't be that way. And I think you all know that. Whether you live in downtown Durham, rural Halifax County, the suburbs of Charlotte, all North Carolinians believe that our kids deserve better. So where do we turn to? So, obviously our kids deserve books that were published in the last decade. They deserve teachers that aren't driven out of the profession by pitiful salaries. They deserve bus drivers and cafeteria workers who earn a living wage. They deserve school buildings with working air conditioning and safe drinking water. My son should not be mopping up the 3rd floor of the Durham School of the Arts because the ceiling is leaking. None of this should be controversial and none of it should be political, but it is. And we're having to go to the courts to fight for this. And it's been 17 years. I've got a 20-year-old, an 18-year-old, and a 6-year-old. Like, I've seen the full spectrum of this and why we should be stepping up here. So we are turning to our courts. As you probably heard in the news, Judge Lee basically ordered the legislature to stop playing political games and put the desperately needed resources into our public education system. And what was the response? They threatened to impeach him. They removed him from the case. These are all things that, these are attacks on judicial independence. Our courts should be able to make decisions without threat from another branch of government. And that's, that's the challenges that we're seeing. We're seeing our courts step up and protect people's individual rights and liberties. And then they turn around and they face things like impeachment or the threat of impeachment, which is just bullying. So, as you know, in 2004, Democrats tried to make a better court system. They passed a groundbreaking judicial election reform. This included nonpartisan judicial elections and the option to voluntarily opt into a public financing program for statewide judicial candidates, Court of Appeals, and Supreme Court, so they didn't have to raise money from wealthy special interests. So after the 2010 election, Republicans regained the majority in the North Carolina General Assembly. They used that majority to roll back all these great reforms. They eliminated judicial public financing. We became the first state in over 100 years to go backwards, to go from nonpartisan judicial elections back to partisan judicial elections. So this has been an ongoing battle. Next slide. So, court bashing. As our courts have continued to step up and protect our rights and liberties, they have continuing to come under attack. And we have seen this like no other state in the country here in North Carolina. We have seen so many attacks on judicial independence. The following are just some of the many examples that the legislative leadership in Raleigh have done to threaten judicial independence in our state. First, they eliminated public financing for judicial campaigns. So now judges are forced to raise political contributions from law firms and special interests with cases in front of the court. Then, after failing with the retention election scheme in 2015, they tried to convince outgoing Governor Pat McCrory to pack the North Carolina Supreme Court in 2016. This was one of those like specter that you heard about, and we understood to be real. But later in December, Pat McCrory actually put out a press release saying that he too helped stop attempts to pack the North Carolina Supreme Court. After that, we saw multiple bills moving judicial elections from nonpartisan judicial elections back to partisan judicial elections. And this is the way I like to explain this. Judges don't wear red robes or blue robes. They don't represent a political party, and they're not supposed to. They're supposed to be independent. They don't wear red robes or blue robes. They wear black robes because they are there to rule on the rule of law. All right. After that, they actually tried to cancel the 2018 judicial and district attorney primaries. They tried to cancel an election. That's something you're not supposed to see in a democracy. That effort failed. Then we saw judicial gerrymandering. Multiple bills trying to gerrymander judicial boundaries to increase the number of Republican judges and force many Black judges off the bench or in runoffs or double bunking them. Stop that. Next, we saw an attempt to eliminate judicial elections altogether. There's multiple plans that they were trying to put forth in 2017 and 2018, where they were looking at to the north of us and to the south of us, Virginia and South Carolina, and they're like, ooh, these states have legislative appointment of judges. I know, you're thinking checks and balances right here, me too. They're the only two states in the country that do legislative appointment of judges, and it's largely seen as largely seen as bad judicial reform. So, and it was the Republican leadership in the North Carolina General Assembly at the time who was trying to do this. It finally got so much backlash that it got watered down to an amendment on the 2018 ballot. You probably remember you had several constitutional amendments then. Again, the courts made them rewrite the language because for this one, they were trying to pretend like it was merit selection, but it really wasn't. It was legislative appointment. So they were trying to whittle it down. The amendment, as you know, was about a vacancy situation. If there was a vacancy, it's not the governor who appoints, it's the legislature who appoints. That amendment failed. It was actually part of a larger court packing scheme because they were trying to rig the courts. Then there's been multiple bills threatening to change all judicial terms, even for the state Supreme Court. State Supreme Court, Court of Appeals, they run every 8 years to kind of keep them insulated from, political maneuvering. They wanted them to go down to 2 years, forcing nonstop judicial campaigns. That bill failed, thankfully. And the most recent, you've probably heard about in this December, they were putting out threats to impeach judges in the Leandro case and putting out rumors of threats to impeach judges in redistricting cases. Those have not come to fruition yet, but we still have some ongoing cases. The scheme that they were putting forth was the way impeachment works in North Carolina. You can start impeachment in the House. You have to have a majority. Republicans have a majority in the House. But in order to get it through the Senate, you have to have 2/3. So what they were putting forth as their strategy, and they actually put this in writing and published it, which I find interesting, is that they were just going to impeach in the House and then slow walk the Senate trial. Impeachment would sideline the judges and could change the balance of the Supreme Court. This is what they were trying to do. This is what the legislative leadership in Raleigh was considering doing. This was an attempt to bully judges to make different judicial decisions. So next slide, please. So obviously, our democracy needs independent courts now more than ever. Everything in America is so polarized right now, with more and more politicians pandering to the most extremes. Now, in times like these, it is vital that we have an independent courts to help protect everyday folks and safeguard our freedoms, especially from politicians who only care about the power of getting reelected. So that's what you're seeing with the gerrymandering and the lack of movement on other issues that we as Americans are, clamoring for them to step up and do. Now, the founders intentionally created a system that distributes power between the state and federal government. Now, I've talked a lot about state courts, and so state courts there help fulfill the founders' intent by protecting people's individual liberties and rights in each state. So the bottom line is politicians and money special interests are trying to undermine the independence of our state courts and improperly influence judges in order to get cases decided in their favor. Now, it is our job as citizens in a democracy to draw a line in the sand and protect our institutions of our democracy. Now, the courts clearly have been there for us, as I've shown you. Now it's our turn to stand up and protect our courts. Next slide. So how do we do that? How do we do that, y'all? Well, the first thing I'm going to tell you to do is to educate your people about the importance of judicial elections and ensure that they vote down ballot. Tell your congregations about what the courts have the capacity to do or not do, so that they understand why it's incredibly important to, keep voting and go down ballot and vote in these very important elections. We see a big problem with drop off in these type of elections, even though they're incredibly vital to our democracy. The second thing you can do is you can advocate for the adoption of strong judicial reforms. One is recusal reform. This is kind of creating a nonpartisan review board that determines whether judges should be allowed to rule on cases due to a conflict of interest in recusal. This is recusal reform. And why I say this is incredibly important is because we don't have any version of recusal reform in this state. You know, when we've been advocating for it, but right now, a justice or a judge can just decide whether or not they should recuse from a case or not. Case in point, Justice Phil Berger Jr. is still deciding on cases where his father is a plaintiff, and that seems like a pretty big conflict of interest to me. So we should just create a nonpartisan review board to help make that determination. Another thing we should do is create an independent review board to discipline Supreme Court justices for ethical violations. We also need our judicial candidates to return to nonpartisan judicial elections so they're not beholden to any political party or special interest. We should also return to judicial public financing. You know, we should be providing judicial candidates with the option to voluntarily opt in to a judicial public campaign dollar system where they don't have to raise big money, money from big donors and groups. They can raise money from people like you and me who can give small dollar donations. This would prevent judges from being influenced by campaign contributions they receive from lawyers, companies, and other groups that appear in the courtroom. So state courts need to be free from outside influence. They need to be free from special interests. They need to be free from other branches of government trying to influence them so that they can deliver equal justice and give every person a ruling that is impartial, fair, and independent. Next slide. So thank you for having me here today. My name is Melissa Price Kromm, North Carolina Voters for Clean Elections. If you want to continue this conversation via email, there's my email. I'm also happy to answer any questions you guys have at this point about why judicial independence is incredibly vital to our democracy.
Thank you so much, Melissa. So many questions. That was really helpful. And I'm going to have to go back to the slide deck, I think, for my own understanding and do some learning. I think that we're at a place right now where the education around these issues is really lacking. Of course, that's why we're having this focus for the critical issues seminar this year around the ties that bind us and what is at stake, at risk with regards to democracy. And especially here, I think what really stood out is what's going on in North Carolina and then how that gets mimicked other places around the country. I appreciated while you were speaking, Julie Wilson in the chat said, who is they? They tried to, who are they? And grateful for our executive director, Jennifer Copeland, who said they are the North Carolina General Assembly members from the party currently in the majority. And I, as I was listening, that began to make more and more sense. And it's interesting because I think sometimes, because the General Assembly is political, right? It's designed to be political. There are multiple parties that make up the General Assembly, and that goes back and forth. So I'd be curious, from your experience, what we have these three branches of government, right? And if you can just kind of lay that out on a big picture level and what the intention, you started out, but if you can remind us again, the intention of the court to be nonpartisan, that's from day one, right? Where did that come from? Is that something that you feel you can answer? You can unmute there too, if you, yeah.
No, our courts definitely, our founders designed a system that had checks and balances in it. I've heard Jennifer Copeland talk about it as a three-legged stool, which I think is a great analogy. And so it's like, when you lose one of those stools, do you want to sit on that anymore? But that's the thing. It's having a system of checks and balances, having a system that helps one another uphold our system of democracy is incredibly vital. So when one branch gets infected, like they're attempting to infect and inject partisan influence into our independent courts, you're going to lose a branch there. You're going to lose it to special interests who want to take over and make decisions in our country that are not responsible to we the people. And that's what we are continuing to see as people are attacking especially our state courts.
And I'm just going to keep asking questions until the lovely folks that are on the Zoom put some more questions into the chat. So obviously there's a lot of attention, and in the last two sessions that we had on Monday and Tuesday, often the media came up in the conversation. And so I think, part of the incredible polarization that's taking place across this country, much of it is very media generated, right? And then we sort of follow that lead of where we hear our news and things like that. So in your, rich experience in working on this issue, where do you see the media coming in or not? Or what role do they or do they not play in creating some of the tension around what's going on in the courts?
The fourth branch of government is what people refer to the media as. So yes, I do think that they have the ability to influence. And I think what we're seeing now with the growth of media and the different types of media, including social media, is that that's feeding this fire of polarization. And I know this is slightly different than the general media, but you have to understand where a bulk of media, of where people get their information from now, is social media. And so we're seeing this increased polarization with private companies who run these social media outfits in the similar way that private companies run like Fox News and stuff, where they're just kind of feeding the hate and that increasing polarization. We just had a mass murder in Buffalo, Texas, and this person got indoctrinated, whether it be media or social media, about a replacement theory and went and murdered people. This same hate is part of a political strategy. That's what's so disheartening. It's the same political strategy that's trying to take over our court system. It's either they're trying to turn you away from your self-interest, or they're trying to tell you that your vote doesn't matter, so don't engage. And so it's really challenging to see how people in America are getting influenced, and how it's all connected. How it's connected to the attacks on our courts, the attacks on our voting rights, to attacks on our body autonomy, to attacks of our education system.
Yeah. For all the justice issues that we, as a 501c3 council of churches made up of these 18 denominations, so many people across the state, and we put justice first. I mean, that's what we're looking towards. And so inherently, we look to the courts for that justice, to get out, like I like what you said, of not a red robe or a blue robe, that there's a space in the public square, in our communities and in our government, where justice can be served. And if that's what is at threat to the core, I think, all the folks on the Zoom today and all the people that are going to be watching this recording and discussing, I'm the first person, as someone who admitted in my introduction, I've been working at the North Carolina Council of Churches for 11 years. I spent a lot of time advocating at the General Assembly. Because of my work with the National Interfaith Power and Light, spent a lot of time with the federal government as well. I can name my elected officials in the state house and in the federal government. I personally cannot name our court justices. I don't feel as though I have a relationship with them. I think many of us would think that the only time that you would get to know a judge is if you're in front of it for some reason, some in front of them. So, with the work that you do with your organization, what would you say? I know you gave us some, vote, advocate, understand, the different spaces, but what is that kind of relationship with the general public and the courts? It's, again, like, I know some of the Supreme Court justices, because they, quite frankly, get some media attention, but in North Carolina, I'd love to hear just like your personal, kind of, should we be building relationships with these folks? I mean, they probably don't have social media accounts, right? For the very purpose of that would be inappropriate if they were putting their personal opinions out into the world. Like, just love to hear your sort of general public thoughts about that.
Well, they run for election. They're requesting your vote. You have an opportunity to interact and understand who they are in the public square. So yes, you should be getting to know who these people are to give them your vote.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not going to go into detail, at least they shouldn't go into details about how they would rule in future, because that's not how, there's like kind of judicial codes of conduct on this.
Mm-hmm.
But you can get an understanding of like, are they activist judges in the sense of like they're going to not really care about your rights and liberties and just do whatever they want, or are they there to uphold the rule of law? I think these are things that you can learn through going through that experience of making your decision on how to vote. But that's the thing. People don't vote in these elections. They're down ballot races, so they don't go that far sometimes. So I would strongly urge people to do their research. You can look at past judicial opinions they've done. There will be judicial guides out there. There will be endorsements. These are things you should pay attention to when you're trying to make your decision, and absolutely engage in these elections. And get your friends and families and your congregations to engage in these elections. Because as I've shown you through this presentation, there are many, many ways your courts can affect your daily lives. And that's what a lot of people don't see, is how one vote or two votes on a ballot for a judge can impact their daily lives. And
Right.
so, yeah, you saw like, 10 years ago, when we were having the equality amendment come down, it's like you had clerks of court saying, okay, no, here, I'm still gonna marry you. I'm gonna do this. Now you're having DAs saying, with the SCOTUS abortion decision, saying, I'm not going to charge people, if this comes to North Carolina. So these things matter to everyday people, whether they know it yet or not.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And you're right. I mean, I think sometimes, because if you're running for, again, one of the more the political offices, you're getting to like learn everything from all their opinions about on anything. And so the different just the whole different framework of running for a judge seat, and what they, what we as the general public we have to make that commitment to learn, because it's not going to just show up with a ton of, all of the mailings that we just received for the primaries with all the different opinions. And I think that's something that I'm going to personally and professionally commit myself to, is to really better understand that process. And I think, again, the difference between, a federal like judge confirmation that's like live on TV and has turned into a bit of a spectacle, where you really do get to know. I mean, I don't get to make that decision of who that judge is on the Supreme Court, but I certainly have a strong opinion after watching their confirmation hearings as to whether or not, I would vote for them. But I should be that engaged, if not more so, obviously, with the judges here in North Carolina. So thank you for that inspiration and that grounding in what we should be doing as citizens. I know, like, specifically, in the opportunity for you to speak to communities of faith and conscience through the North Carolina Council of Churches. Do you have any specific, you went through the different aspects, but what role do you see that faith communities play to advocate for just judicial reforms that reflect the nonpartisan intent originally designed for our judiciary? I know a lot of churches often don't want to talk about any of this because they feel as though, you know, they don't know what they can or cannot talk about with regards to politics. But what I'm hearing from you is that this should not be political. So
No, it shouldn't be political. And, you know, like I said, the biggest thing you can do to your congregation is, you know, ensure that they are voters, that they get out and vote, and that they vote down ballot. That's all, like, you know, C3 stuff. You can educate your congregation, inform them about what the different down ballot races have the power to do. A lot of people don't understand what power district, superior court, clerk of court, register of deeds, district attorneys, these are all judicial elections, and they don't know what power they have. And so they have power to, like, say, look, I'm not going to charge in all these, low-level cases and lock people up. You know, I have the power to make decisions here. And some of them, you know, Superior Court, these are the beginning of cases that end up in the Supreme Court. And so helping them understand that so that they are active voters in these elections is incredibly vital as we continue to have judicial elections in North Carolina. And then, you know, I think you guys are incredibly, as members of faith, you know, being able to stand up for judicial independence. I know I've seen Jennifer, like I said, talk about the three-legged stool analogy, and it's like, you have this power as representatives of faith to talk about ethics, to talk about ensuring that our judicial branch isn't corrupt, which, you know, this is, you know, where we're headed right now, is that, you know, we have, uh, elected judicial judges in the state that are not beholden to wealthy special interest, that they're there for we the people. So, yeah.
Yeah, and that comes back to the we the people. It's on us to be those people that are engaged. One thing, when you were speaking earlier, I realized, you know, how often, I mean, I didn't grow up in North Carolina, and I think there's more and more people, you know, moving to this area. And something that we talk about at the Council of Churches is, you know, sort of civics 101. I mean, things work differently in different states. And so not necessarily, you know, when we move here, and nor should we be required, but hopefully most of us are interested, and certainly the kinds of people that participate in a critical issue seminar like this. I'm just going to drop, because I Googled it while you were talking, I dropped the North Carolina Constitution into the chat here. As you know, so could you speak? I don't expect you to be an expert. That's not what we brought you, you know, here today to talk about the North Carolina Constitution, but the Constitution in relationship to the courts. How is that interplay happen? Is that what they're referencing? Is that the check and balance that everything is going by? Or just, can you speak a little bit to that? And I hope thinking of other questions, so it's not just me asking questions, but I'm really interested in this.
So North Carolina's Constitution was rewritten after the Civil War, for good measure. At the time, we had legislative appointment of judges. And so you can imagine what people in the 1860s were thinking when they were rewriting this. So that's how we got judicial elections. But we also got a lot of really good protections, like equal protection under the law. And so that's why I say, like, read your Constitution. It's incredibly rich. I'm not a lawyer, so I can't give you legal advice on the Constitution. But, the US Constitution is like a floor, but most state constitutions have a lot more protections and liberties in it. And so when I say that 95% of all court cases go through the state courts, your state courts are your beacon. They're your beacon of hope in this country. You have to protect them because they can do so much. Like I've shown you with, protecting education, protecting funding, stopping attacks, like rigging our elections and power grabs and gerrymandered maps. And I didn't even, I was kind of sticking with some of the issues. I know it's a lot more broad than just that. But this is our state courts standing up for you, standing up for your rights and protections. And so it's just incredibly vital that we are there to protect it as it is protecting us.
That's really helpful. And I am going to sit and read this Constitution and I want to know it a lot better. I know parts of it. I do a lot of environmental advocacy, so I know some pieces around what we should be doing to protect our environment, but all of the protections that we care about is so critical. Rachel Baker has just asked in the chat, where do we find comprehensive resources that we can disseminate to our faith communities, which includes all of the information you shared that is explained plainly and easily, something as simple as a one-pager?
Good question. I am happy to share my slides here. I can also point you to, we have a website called Fair Courts NC that you're happy to take a look at.
Awesome.
This is kind of like more of a campaign website trying to stop attacks to our courts, but it does kind of have some of the history and research and take action moments on it. But yeah.
I appreciate that. Definitely the plainly and easily is what we find, starting at what are the three branches of government, who represents me, those kinds of conversations. And so I know that I need to update my advocating with compassion presentation that I give that includes the judges that represent us. And the way that they represent us is so unique. I'm just feeling a lot of passion now. I'm recognizing of wanting the faith community space is the perfect place to talk about the courts, to your point, because it is nonpartisan, and that's what we want to be as well. We want to focus on justice. So this is like an obvious partnership with the work that you do. Since I don't see any other questions right now in the chat, I guess I want to ask you a personal question about how you got into this work.
Well, I was born and raised here in North Carolina, and I thought I was going to go to law school. And I met my stepkids and decided to be a mom. And this job came available and I was recruited to do it because I really cared about judicial public financing and protecting it. And I've been here for 12 years. So added another kid along the way. But yeah, this is, just I'm here for my state. I'm want to do what's right and make a better North Carolina.
Well, thank you, because you are obviously, I have so much gratitude and respect for your work. And I love that you were like, because I care about judicial public financing. That's, people don't just like walk down the street and say that, right? Maybe a lot of us didn't quite, before your presentation just now, know what judicial public financing was, or that it had been taken away. And how we, become a voice of support for that as well. So thank you. Do you have any questions for us? Actually, Jacqueline just came in with a question. Very informative discussion. Oh, she gave another resource. You Can Vote is an excellent org with a wealth of voter education, training, etc. Thank you, Jacqueline, for lifting up You Can Vote. The North Carolina Council of Churches is a champion of You Can Vote. And so we have been giving co-presentations about voter education and voter outreach with You Can Vote. And all of the sessions this week are really part of our campaign to make sure that our leadership and our champions within our communities and congregations have the resources they need to be really engaged. And so, yes, so back to, calling upon us. I know you've given us a lot of things to do, a lot of learning to absorb. Do you have any questions that I can answer in the last couple of minutes that we have here on behalf of the Council of Churches?
No, I want to go back to why it's incredibly important to educate your congregation. I did put in the link from You Can Vote about what's on your ballot. It's an incredibly great resource to kind of explain to your congregation about like what is on your ballot and what you're actually voting for when you vote for these down ballot races, so that you can kind of see like, okay, this role of it could impact healthcare. This could impact criminal justice. This could impact education system. So, I think when more people understand, like, here's all the different ways in which these different elected official offices can benefit us, then they can see why it's so incredibly important to engage in and vote in these races. And I want to remind everyone, we have two major state Supreme Court races on the ballot this November. Courts should not be partisan, but they are partisan, so I'll have to say it this way. The balance of the North Carolina Supreme Court is up. And if it flips, it will stay that way till 2028, which means our ability to go through the state courts and get rulings on redistricting, education, environmental issues are all over until 2028. And so it is incredibly vital that people understand what's at stake this election and why you need to get out and vote in these down ballot judicial elections.
Wow, that just hit pretty hard. The number 2028 is, that's a long time. And when we see what's happening all across the country and the role that North Carolina can and should be as a leader in the South, it's okay. I've got my charge between now and November of making sure that every single person across the state understands what is at stake. And we really, really honor your time. Love all these great resources. Vote 411, good resource for voters, League of Women Voters online resources. Thank you for that, Brenda. Pam Jones, Democracy NC, another great resource. Let's all join forces together and fight for justice. We're strengthening unity, peace through justice. That is the North Carolina Council of Churches motto. So I just want to thank you again for your time and leadership, Melissa. And we will be praying for you in this very challenging work that you lead. And we will be listening and following and acting and advocating and voting. So thank you again. And thank you everyone who joined us today for this very important conversation. You got some great accolades in the chat there, Melissa, of people thanking you for your presentation. We look forward to receiving your slides. And again, this will be posted on YouTube. I think we all, recognize that we need to get this out far and wide, this message. So we're going to go ahead and close as we've been closing every day with our liturgy. And if you will join me, I will read this. And if you would join me in reading in the bold, you can go ahead and stay on mute, but we will know that we are sharing these words together. So join me with this closing. God of all the ages, who has seen every nation rise and many nations fall, endow in us the wisdom necessary to be a nation that rises to your call for justice and peace. God of all truth, who sees all eternity in the blink of an eye, bestow upon us the humility to listen to those who differ from us so that we may know your truth. God of all people, who has marked each of us as holy by creating each of us in your image, impart to us the courage to create a society where each of us can flourish to the fullness of our ability. May we go in peace and grace. God bless. Thank you.